Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. In our last lecture, we looked at the study of stylistics from the point of view of linguistics, with our special reference on the technique and methods employed by formalism. As we have seen in our last or few lectures, that formalism had a great impact on the study of literary style from the perspective of a linguist, which has enhanced the value, the meaning and significance of the language for the sake of literary analysis. In today's lecture, we will look at literary stylistics, that what literary stylistics takes into account when it analyzes the literary texts. Because we looked at the formal stylistics or linguist's approach from the point of view of a stylistician, that he looks at stylistics with special reference to language. And that also in terms of its grammar, structure, composition, phonetic, phonemic level, and its graphological as well as rhythmic level. Now we will look at stylistics from the point of view of a literary critic or from the point of view of a literary stylistician, which is often referred to as literary stylistics. In order to understand what literary stylistics is, we will explore what approaches and methods are employed by literary stylisticians in order to analyze the text. In our today's lecture, just the way we looked at the strengths of formalism and its merits and demerits, we will also look at the strengths of literary stylistics, its merits, its demerits, as well as what are the special features that literary stylistics takes into account while analyzing the literary texts. Literary stylistics is a branch or a field of stylistics that has helped stylistics emerge as a separate field of the study and analysis of literary texts that attempts to deal with the complex and valued language within literature. Now, just like formalism, literary stylistics also recognizes the fact that the language of literature is complex and valuable. Hence, it is complex, distinct, and unique. It demands that its value must be understood or estimated through the minute understanding of the details of the features that occur in the text. So, when the literary stylistician gives importance to the literary language, he tries to find out the significance and the value of the devices, the features that occur in literary text, which distinguish it as a writing from other writings of the present or the contemporary time, as well as how this writing is distinctive and unique on the basis of its stylistic features and its language from what has been produced earlier, and also what has been produced in the years that would be the contemporary time in which the writer is writing. So, according to Crystal, who in the Cambridge Encyclopedia of Language states that the examination of literary stylistics examines the language with a scope that is narrowed down to concentrate on the more appealing and striking features of language. For example, when the analysis of a literary stylistician is specific and is narrowed down to the point that he must concentrate on the striking features of the language, these features might be labeled as the deviant or the abnormal usage of language. Now, deviant and abnormal usage of language is mostly the same usage of language which we encounter mostly in poetry and literature, and seldom do we find it in ordinary language. So, the deviant and striking features are the abnormalities of language, which are the curiosities that a reader encounters in the text. And these features might also be the broader structure or the composition of the text and the language. So, literary stylistics focuses its attention on the abnormalities, the curiosities, the deviation that occurs in the literary writings. And the scope is narrowed down to pick up those devices, to pick up those stylistic features, rather than the composition or the style in general. Only the features of style are picked up by a literary stylistician who focuses on the valuable, complex, and unique structure of the language of the literary texts. Literary stylistics is the study of the compact language of poetry, because poetry gives more room and margin to the stylisticians and literary critics to explore the meanings and messages which are encoded in these strange words and symbols. So the compact language of poetry is more likely to reveal the secrets of its construction, and it also demands from the stylistician a very detailed attention to be paid to the abnormalities and distinguished features of language. As compared to the language of novel, fiction and plays, the language of poetry provides the wealth of such devices which are not encountered in prose, fiction or ordinary language. So this compact language of poetry is what makes the basis for the literary stylistician to observe the intricacies of style, form and the medium being used by the artist or the writer. Widdowson, commenting upon the literary stylistics, its significance, its scope and its relevance to the study of poetry and literature, states that poetry is unorthodox, poetry is unconventional, it is unusual, and the language that is unorthodox within the use of poetry and expression of poetry, that is not only distinctive because of its separate identity within a text, for example in the form of a metaphor or a conceit or an analogy, but it is also complex because of the intertextual references and implications. Now, what are the functions that the words, devices and abnormalities of language play within a particular scope and context in which they are used? So these intertextual implications of the curious use of language, abnormalities of language, unusual deviant way of using language is what makes the job of a literary stylistician more specific, that he has to go for the relevant material, that is the use of the abnormal, deviant and extraordinary language. Widdowson has suggested that the importance of poetic form or the poetic expression is more deeper for the analysis or the linguistic as well as literary analysis, because more deviant forms of expression, of communication, expression of the aesthetic communication may abound in the poetic language. And when the poetic language makes use of quite unorthodox, even compact, brief expression, that brief and compact expression further makes the expression ambiguous and difficult for understanding of the reader. So those difficulties are enhanced when a reader encounters certain devices which are meaningful, which are suggestive and which are also symbolic. So in this case, the compact language of poetry, which is composed of certain devices which the writer relies on to convey the meaning, are to be understood by picking up the items and curiosities and deviations of language from the text. The stylistician would give meaning to those deviant forms. Either those deviant forms are there in the form of imagery, metaphor, or even in the form of the structural composition that is deviant grammatically or structurally or syntactically. So apart from the analysis of the individual deviations and unusual metaphors and similes within the text, the critics of literary stylistics like Widdowson, they suggest that even the intertextual implications, the relationships of the device with the form, the relationship of the device with the theme and message must also be investigated. So what a particular device has to convey about the theme of the story, about the form as well as about the composition of style in general, is also to be the job of a literary stylistician. To explain the significance of literary stylistics with reference to poetry, Widdowson further states that the case or the example of poetry for the purpose of analysis is more difficult as compared to the analysis of prose or the genres of novel and play, where the conversations are lengthy and descriptive. The writer will not create ambiguity in the text, whereas the compact language of poetry allows the writer a room to present things in a complex way, and that complex way becomes further complicated for the analyst to decipher and understand when he has used unusual, far-fetched comparisons, similes, metaphors, analogies, and even imagery. Now, to understand those things, a writer has to pay specific attention to those details. Widdowson notices that when the content of poetry is summarized, it often refers to every general, unimpressive observation, such as the analysis of these lines would enable us to understand what are Widdowson's observations about the general analysis of poetry. Widdowson is raising a kind of opposition to those methods of text analysis, specifically poetic analysis, where we generalize our understanding, meaning, and interpretation of a poem. For example, giving the examples of two poets, Shakespeare and Donne, Widdowson explains the idea of generalization and very crude remarks and interpretations of poetry. For example, observe these examples. The first is from Shakespeare, that he states, "Like as the waves make towards the pebbled shore, so do our minutes hasten to their end." Now, any layman who is reading these lines, if he interprets these lines or tries to give meaning to these lines, would feel that the poem is referring towards the passage of time, that how quickly time passes, that nothing is there in our hands. Similarly, in the second example from John Donne's poem, "Love, all alike, no season knows nor clime, nor are days, months, which are the rags of time." Now, commenting upon this second example, a layman or an inexpert person would comment that this composition talks about the notion of love, that love is great, that love is unchangeable, love is eternal. So, Widdowson claims that these interpretations of the poetry in this general and very superficial a manner would be inappropriate to be considered as a stylistic analysis, because all the time our attention is not focused on the devices used by the writer in the text or the poetry, but we focus on the messages and we make generalizations and certain crude and superficial comments about the meaning of texts. So if we say about these two examples that we have read from Shakespeare and Donne's poems, that we may say it is about the transience of life, how time passes quickly, how life is lonely, how life is sad due to the issue that it comes to an end very soon without our realization. And then Donne's poem may be referring only to the idea of love, eternity, and spirituality. To Widdowson, these analyses are not rigorous because they are based on the message only and no reference is made to the style of the poetry. Widdowson states that this has really damaged the literary analysis about poems and literature, because our perception or approach of analyzing the literary texts really ignore the intricate, complicated aspects of language which they consider as deviant or abnormal or unusual, as the writer has put in great effort to create this expression. And by generalizing the messages and themes of the poem, we are ignoring those aspects which have painstakingly been created and adopted by the writer for the creation of the text. So, Widdowson states that the most obvious of the unconventional styles of language is the language of poetry, and this language gives us new perspective on familiar themes. It allows us to look at these familiar themes from a very different perspective, to place the same familiar words in a new and refreshing context allows the poet the ability to present humanity and communicate honestly. So if this is the task of the poet, that though he is talking about the same old usual ideas, themes and problems of the society, people and humanity, he is presenting them in a fresher way, in a new light. And that freshness and newness is added to the poems or works due to the distinctive use of style. So the language of poetry, if it has been employed with so much intensity, with so much emotion, as well as with so much design and reason behind it, so it cannot be ignored. So in the case of poetry, the analysis has been suffering great neglect due to the ignorance of the nature of the language of poetry, due to the ignorance of the complicated nature of the language of poetry. So Widdowson has given us an insight as literary stylistics must approach the literary texts as distinctive, unique pieces of art or aesthetic expression. And then if we read the ideas which might appear to be the same, but these ideas are presented in a new light with the new language, themes and ideas, we must look at them with a new perspective, because the perspective is enlightening us, because the method of presenting the perspective has changed. The feelings, emotions might be the same, which other poets too must have talked about. But how these poets which we encounter have presented these ideas, these ways won't be the same as the people in the classical age have been writing things about, or writing poems about the notions which we already know about. So in this way, poetry is ambiguous, complex, because of its language, because of its over-dependence and excessive use of devices. And according to Widdowson, poetry is not possible without deviation, without the use of imagery, and without the use of figurative language. So when a poet relies mostly on the literary devices and figurative devices, the job of a stylistician is that he should also look at the literary aspects of style. The literary aspect of style would connect language to its message. Then messages might be familiar, but the ways of presenting the messages are unfamiliar, new, unusual and attractive. Here also we can talk about one of the limitations of the approach of literary stylistics, just the way we looked at the approach of formalist stylistics, that when formalists pay more attention to the work and relegate or ignore the personality of the author and the time in which he was writing, they look at the works or writings from a limited or from a very you can say narrow perspective. So if that perspective has become narrow or limited, that it is not taking into account another side of analysis, it would of course face criticism. Literary stylistics also, just like formalist stylistics, face criticism on this particular part, that there are two aspects of observing style when the literary stylistician approaches a text. And this problem has been highlighted, or this limitation of literary stylistics has been highlighted by Wetherill. Wetherill says that there are two problems with literary analysis or literary stylistics analysis. That one thing is that there might be over occupation or extra emphasis on particular features while the literary stylistician analyzes the text, specifically poetry. He states that overemphasis on a single feature or a few features of the poem or the text would minimize our attention and focus on certain other significant features that might be embedded and found in the text. So when literary stylistics focuses its attention on only some specific features of style, that are the devices particularly or the imagery, nothing else, then the problem arises that there might be other features worth noting which might also enhance or add to the meaning of the text, but they will be ignored because a literary stylistician is focusing more on the curiosities of language, distinctive features of style, those distinctive features which are unusual, strange, deviant or abnormal from the point of view of grammar, from the point of view of literal meaning or the general meaning of those terms. So in this way, Wetherill has examined the analysis of the poetic language from the point of view of a literary stylistician, and claiming that it would limit the analysis because of the fact that the literary stylistician's attention will be focused only on certain particular selected features of a poem. When he selects certain features like imagery and metaphor from the poem, he focuses the attention only on those few aspects, and the rest of the aspects which might be equally important are ignored. Secondly, Wetherill states that any attempt to see a text as simply as a collection of stylistic elements will tend to ignore other ways whereby meaning is produced. So that distinction that has been made by Wetherill states that language contains multiple meanings, and if we consider only style to be the part of the poem or a text where meaning is contained, then other ways of conveying meaning that are employed by the writer in the text, either through tense, either through grammar or shifts in tense and grammar, or syntactical pattern, or even phonology, meter, rhythm, rhyme, these things will be ignored, because a literary stylistician is picking up some specific features of a text. So when a literary stylistician picks up certain distinctive features of a text, he ignores the other parts of the text which might be equally important in conveying meaning. So ignoring other ways through which meaning is produced would be one of the limitations of literary stylistics too, because here the literary stylistician is limiting his analysis on the study of the style of language by picking up abnormalities of language, curiosities of language, and the strange employment and use of language. Look at it from the perspective of an example, the same example that we discussed in the last lecture, that was the poem by John Donne, Valediction Forbidding Mourning. Now if a stylistician picks up analogies and metaphors and conceits used by Donne in the poem, he would focus his attention only on what meanings do these curious use of language, for example the deviations or the foregrounded feature of the conceit, reveal. The rest of the poem would go ignored. It would be ignored by the poet, it would be ignored by the analyst, because his attention is focused only on the specific literary feature that is enhancing the meaning, or that is capturing the attention of the reader as a foregrounded reality in the poem. So in this way, when a stylistician is attempting to see the text as only collection of certain stylistic devices, he picks up imagery only, he picks up metaphors, similes and personifications only. But the text is not just composed of similes, metaphors and personifications only. There are other features of language too. There are other deviant and unusual and strange ways within the text through which the writer is conveying a message. But the limitation of a literary stylistician would be that he would ignore other aspects apart from the literary features or stylistic elements, the deviations. Now let us look at the prevalent approaches or the dominant approaches in the literary stylistics. Just the way we looked at formalism to see what are the features that formalist approach focuses on while analyzing the text, like its literariness, its foregrounded realities, its use of grammar and deviation. Now, in the same way, we will look at the approaches devised by those who propose the study of style of language to begin from the study of its specific use of language, its functions and features which are employed by the writer, which perform the job of communication as well as aesthetic pleasure for the reader and the writer too. So the approaches employed in the literary stylistics are to be looked at with great detail, because we want to learn how a literary stylistician would approach a text. What features would he pay attention to in order to make meanings, in order to generate interpretations, and in order to investigate the messages of the writers. Literary stylistics, having to do largely with style, is a discipline concerned with the study of language of literature. It is the study of the language of art. As the study of style, it seeks to examine the expressive and suggestive devices. Now here we put emphasis on these terms like examining the expressive and suggestive devices. Now literary stylistic is picking up only suggestive and expressive devices. There might be other devices and use of language too, but only suggestive and expressive devices like literary devices, similes, metaphors, and figures of speech or imagery, only these things would be picked up by the literary stylistician. And these have been taken into consideration, or they have been given significance, because this literary analyst considers that the writer has enforced these words, figures, and images into text because he had a particular design, because he had a particular intention to convey something special through these devices. So we understand the power and penetration of the speech, especially the speech or language of poetry and literature, that how powerful and forceful the language becomes when the writers endow it with devices or figurative images. So in this way, literary stylistics would focus on the language of literature as it is the expression of art, it is the expression of style, and then the language is powerful and meaningful, which is comprising of the expressive devices and suggestive devices. So here the focus of the literary stylistician is picking up the devices from the work and examining them, and how these devices act within the context of a particular work, what work these devices perform, how do they make the text more meaningful, is the job of a literary stylistician, because he is concerned with the messages rather than the composition and the formation of these devices and text. So a literary stylistician will not explore how these devices are made, what are the phonological or alliterative patterns, for example. This is not the concern of the literary stylistician. A literary stylistician is concerned with these suggestive and figurative devices from the angle of the analyst who is interpreting these for meaning. Now, from among the many approaches or ways in which literary stylistics approaches the text or literary writings, the first one that we are going to examine is called the thematic approach. Thematic approach is similar to the understanding of the main idea of a literary work. We often use thematic approach in our analysis of a literary work, that the theme of any literary work, that is the main idea or the message of the writing, is conveyed by the writer through the words, images, symbols, metaphors that he employs. So the thematic approach looks at text as a message, text as expression of a writer's feelings, which carries an idea, which the reader has to understand, which the reader has to guess through his reading. The theme may have psychological, sociological, ethical, didactic, or moral value. So any writer would be forced to write either on some issue which has given him a sort of psychological, you can say, setback, or it has a psychological impact on his mind, his emotions, his thoughts, or he may be affected by something that he has witnessed in the society in the form of maybe discrimination, injustice, or some plight, or some habit of people. Then there might be certain ethical and moral issues that the poet or the writer might have encountered in the society. For example, the issues like you can say corruption, cheating, bribery, all these issues which have moral or ethical or didactic implication. These are what the writer may like to convey through a particular style in a specific work that he is writing. So the thematic approach tries to distill or figure out what aspects, either moral, political, psychological, sociological, didactic or religious, are inherent within a text, and how these aspects or issues are commenting upon the writer's specific bent of mind, or which particular lesson does he want the reader to understand. So when the lessons given or the messages given by the writer may have either psychological, sociological, ethical or political leaning, then these approaches which specifically deal with the theme would be more specific to be utilized by a literary stylistician. And a work, it is the skeletal framework, or it is the broader framework of the writing with which the whole story hangs. So the analogy of a rope and a nail is being used over here, that we hang the idea and theme of the story with particular words, language, symbols. So this is the theme which the writer wants the reader to reach to. It obsesses him and he is compelled to express it, and to give a fresher look, perspective and idea to something that he has been affected by, something that he has been maybe attracted by, or in the way that he may also be pained or troubled by something in the society or in his life that he wants to convey to the reader. So we feel that the writing has both internal and external value, and these values distinguish it from all other works of literary art. For example, the moral dimension of the work can be studied through our study of maybe Dickinson's poetry, how we look at it that she has given a way to her ideological or psychological trappings. She looks at the world in her poems. Emily Dickinson looks at the world in her poem as an entrapment, as an imprisonment, and the loneliness and the solitude that she suffers with is something that she wants to give vent to. So that is the psychological trapping of the soul of the author, which is being given a voice by the poet in the form of the poems. And the poems have a special psychological message for the world or the reader. Similarly, observe Jonathan Swift's prose, his writings, and for example his work Gulliver's Travels, or his work that is prose essay Modest Proposal. These works by Jonathan Swift have ideological, didactic as well as ethical or sociological leaning. He is giving us a message that is political, at the same time social as well as didactic too, because he is conveying his disdain or his displeasure at the plight and the situation of the humanity, that how degraded human being has become, that they are lesser than the animals, and they have become quite brutal and grotesque, that they are a very ugly sight to look at. So this is because of the immorality or the lack of ethical religious values in the society that has made Swift to comment upon it. So these are the themes of the writings. With reference to Emily Dickinson's themes, we looked at them from the psychological perspective as the loneliness and trappings of the soul and mind, and looking at Jonathan Swift's prose writing, we find in his writing the political, ideological, ethical and moral themes, which he conveys through either the mode of satire, irony, or even the grotesque or the brutal that he makes use of in his works. So thematic approach is when we look at a text in order to find out, in order to locate within it what message does the writer want to convey to the reader? What is the meaning of the writing? Does it have anything to do with politics, ideology, or with morals and ethics of the society and the social system? Or is it an expression of the trappings of the soul or mind, that is the psychological aspect of the story? So when we approach the text in this way, to locate its theme with reference to either the sociological, political, or moral leanings, then we are looking at the work from the perspective of the thematic approach. Thematic approach is to find out the theme of the poem, to locate within the work the theme or the messages which might have the psychological, sociological, ethical, moral, political leaning. In the use of thematic approach, the language is seen as author's main linguistic tool, which is employing to convey meaning, and which also is not just the composition of words, but also a particular distinctive use of structure too. But apart from linguistic components, the author will have to clothe his story with a style. This is how the theme is expanded. Otherwise, there will be no story or the poem. So the story of the writing, the idea of the writing or the message of the writing is always covered or expressed through words and style. If we look at the previous example, that how Swift through the style of irony and satire, as he is presenting the state of the humanity of his time, where people have grown complacent, indifferent, crude, and unethical and immoral too. That has been conveyed through the style that is satire or irony. Now, satire and irony suit him most when he is giving us kind of an indictment or criticism of the society. So look how the message that is social, moral, political too, because he is also giving a message to the politicians or the heads of the states for their poor governance, not only to the common man or the public for its immorality and for its lack of the religious understanding or the meaning of human life. Here we notice that the style that is using irony, satire for criticism on humanity and humans' actions, he is employing it to convey a theme that is showing us the difference between the present state of humanity and what is expected of the humanity as behavior. So when he looks at the lack of civilization, lack of ethics and morals in the society, he wants to criticize it with the help of satire and irony. So this is the style that the literary stylistician is concerned with, that how this style is enhancing the message of the author, the theme of the author, that is the indictment or criticism of the society. And it has been presented with such devices like irony and satire. So this is how the theme is connected with the language. The theme or message is connected with the style of a work. Theme is criticism on the society, its immorality, its degradation, its corruption. And the form is satire or irony that Swift employs in his prose, Gulliver's Travels or even Modest Proposal. Now we have seen that how a literary stylistician who is approaching a text from a thematic approach or from thematic perspective, he would try to locate the meanings, the messages and the ideas of the poet or the writer, how it has been conveyed by using a specific distinctive style. In this example, we looked at the style is satirical or ironical, and the theme is indictment and criticism on the immorality and degradation of the society. Now, in literary stylistics, the second approach that is employed by the analysts or the critics is referred to as approach in which you interpret characters. You focus your analysis on the interpretation and analysis of the characters, their behavior, their motives, their appearances, how they have been created, what functions do they perform. So this is the interpretation of characters, the second approach of the literary stylistics, and the first one was thematic approach. In thematic approach, we try to locate and find out the theme of the poem, which is the underlying message behind the story and actions of the characters. Now, interpretation of characters would be of many dimensions. There are a number of dimensions in the approach which is called interpretation of characters. So, we will look at the dimensions or the aspects of this approach one by one. Firstly, the approach that is referred to is called psychological approach. Here we are psychologically oriented towards the interpretation of the character. Now, what does this interpretation refer to? Psychologically oriented interpretation of the characters is when we see characters as representatives of certain mental types. Now, this means that characters would reveal a particular bent of mind, particular behavior or thoughts or feelings and emotions. There might be characters who would appear to be obsessive. There might be characters who would appear to be proud. There might be characters in the stories and poems or dramas which might be impulsive, rash. Now, this is how we look at a character from a psychological perspective. For instance, see the play Oedipus Rex. Oedipus Rex by Sophocles, that is the classical work that the students of literature start their study of drama with. In Sophocles' play Oedipus Rex, Oedipus, the king, is labeled to be suffering with a feeling that is referred to as rashness. It was considered to be his rashness and also his pride that makes him land into troubles, apart from fate that plays, or gods who play their role in bringing about the demise or doom of the king. Now, Oedipus, in his haste and hurry and impulsiveness, kills a man who later on turns out to be his own father. Then Oedipus is also proud that his pride also leads to his demise or his downfall. Now, when we are looking at the character of Oedipus in the play Oedipus Rex, from the literary stylistician's point of view, who is using the theme or the approach of interpretation of the characters, psychological interpretation of the characters would be his focus. And in this approach, he would try to find out which personality type does the hero belong to. And we found out that the hero belongs to a particular personality type of people who are rash, who are impulsive, and who are proud. And how his personality trait, his rashness, his impulsiveness, and his pride led to the troubles that he faced. Right? So this is how the psychological interpretation of characters makes us focus on the bent of mind, on the psychology of the character, on the emotions of the characters, and the particular nature of the character which his mind and his action reveal to us. So, in the psychological orientation or approach towards the characters, we see the characters to be possessing certain traits or qualities which represent them. These are referred to also as the idiosyncrasies of the characters, but peculiarities of character. For example, being proud, being rash, being dishonest. These things are the psychological bent of mind of the character, which is revealed in the story. And it might be due to these psychological preoccupations or psychological traits of a character that he might behave in a particular way in a particular text. So, a stylistician who is aware of the interpretation of characters and its various angles, when he would look at a character from the psychological perspective, he would try to find out what is strange and unusual in his personality, or what bent of mind and emotions does the character represent, and how these emotions and his personality type lead to the troubles or lead to the type of life that he is leading in the story. The second approach that the literary stylisticians employ when they are using the interpretation of characters. That approach is referred to as sociological approach. Sociological approach, or the sociological interpretation of the characters, treats the characters as members of a certain moment of history, a certain time period. So, according to the sociological approach, we are placing the characters in a society which is affected by certain same issues and problems. For example, in this context, to understand the sociological approach, look at the text that is A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens. Charles Dickens' characters in A Tale of Two Cities, if looked at from the sociological interpretation or perspective, would reveal to us that their intentions, their motives of leading to revolution have been governed and generated by the idea that they were socially and politically oppressed. Poverty, hunger, deprivation in the society has led to this state which prompts them to wage a war against the government, and they turn into revolutionaries. Now, it is the sociological condition, the condition in the society, that has led to make the characters behave in a particular way. So if Dickens' characters in the form of a mob or in the form of the revolutionaries are acting in a rash way, in a cruel way, that was due to the fact that the society was oppressed by the monarchy or the rulers. So when the monarchs or the rulers were indifferent towards the common people, the society began to revolt. They degenerated, they revolted even against the norms and laws of the society and the country. So in this approach, we are putting the characters in a particular time, history and place that is geographically governed and also governed with reference to time. Now the time of Dickens' writing of Tale of Two Cities was that of French Revolution. Now we are putting the characters in that particular time, that how those characters who are now becoming the cause of bringing about a revolution in their country have been economically and socially oppressed. So when they had no voice in the society, when they had been denied rights in the society, they are socially considered to be trapped or enslaved, and that is why they are behaving in a particular way to get liberated. So this is how the analysis of the characters of Dickens' Tale of Two Cities, if looked at from the sociological perspective or interpretation, would generate these meanings, that the characters are suffering as a society is suffering with the lack of sympathy, understanding from the rulers and the heads of the state, and the heads are corrupt and the society is going to revolt against it. So this is how the approach, that is a sociological approach or sociological interpretation of characters, how it would generate meanings for the reader, because the reader is placing the characters in a sociological perspective, in a particular time, place and history, where they are members of a particular society in a moment of history. Now the third way of the interpretation of characters is called the metaphysical interpretation. The metaphysical interpretation and analysis of the characters is where we focus on the images of certain human conditions. For example, aggression or victimization, and also it is seen as damned creatures in the hell. So this metaphysical description is that we place the characters outside the worldly sphere. We place these characters outside the material world. Metaphysical means beyond the reality, existence or the material world. So in our metaphysical interpretation, we look at the characters who are images of the life which is led elsewhere. For example, look at the poems of T.S. Eliot. T.S. Eliot, the 20th century poet, his poems like Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, Hollow Men, and The Wasteland. These poems present characters in the poems who seem to be living in a limbo or hell. Now, those characters looked at from the metaphysical interpretation's point of view will not be seen at leading a day or time of their life, which we as a reader encounter in the poem in the world, but leading those times in the limbo or the hell. For example, the Hollow Men states that the poet conveys to the reader through the hollow men that we are the hollow men, we are the stuffed men, headpiece filled with straw. Here we go round the prickly pear. Now these images of prickly pear, people going round the cactus plant, and these are hollow dummies, carcasses or skeletons. Now this image of the characters evokes the idea that these characters do not exist in the material world, rather they are sinners. So this is the metaphysical way of looking at the text, where the text conveys a meaning beyond the actual surface or appearance meaning. When the characters of T.S. Eliot's poem, for example, Hollow Men, are looked at from the perspective that in the metaphysical interpretation, they are not the inhabitants of this world, but they are inhabitants of hell, living in limbo, because they are roaming around the cactus plants, they are hollow, their heads are filled with straw, they are dummies, or they are skeletons. This imagery and description of the characters evokes this interpretation or idea that is the metaphysical description or the metaphysical interpretation of the characters. So look at it in the retrospect, that the psychological interpretation tells us that we observe the bent of mind or the personality of a character from the particular angle that a character is revealing his aggression, his pride, his idiosyncrasies of mind and psychology, which are making him behave in a particular way. So we pinpoint the cause of a character's becoming what he has become as a psychological cause. Then in the sociological interpretation, we put character in a particular time in history, in a particular age, era, or even place or geography. And we see that how the society, time, and the happenings around the people have affected them and turned them what they are in the story. In the third interpretation of the characters, or the third way of interpretation of characters, we look at them from the metaphysical perspective. That with the help of the example of the Eliot's poem, The Hollow Men, we see that characters represent themselves to be the victims, the sinners, the violators, the criminals that have disobeyed God and have turned themselves into skeletons, ghosts, and dead men while being alive. Right? So the fourth way of interpretation of literary text is referred to as the ethical interpretation. Ethical interpretation of characters is when we see characters depicting certain morality or immorality. Now the ethical interpretation of text is that a character might reveal an idea, either good or bad. For example, observe the example of the play, observe the example of the novel Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. In Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad, we come across certain characters who are revealing the ethical interpretation or the dimension of their characters. For example, we meet Kurtz, the major character whom the protagonist or the narrator of the story, Marlowe, is going to meet. Kurtz is, if looked at from the ethical interpretation's perspective, would be seen as the figure of devil or a person who is governed by greed and lust. Now the ethical dimension would reveal the meanings of the character as greedy, lustful, and lacking self-restraint, hence revealed to be connected with the image of the devil. Now this ethical interpretation is revealing lack of morality of a character and is making him sound or appear like devil. So in ethical interpretation, we label a character as evil or good, as somebody who is pious, holy, or somebody who is despicable or detestable. So this ethical dimension makes us either approve of a character or disapprove of a character due to its traits, which we term either holy or unholy, ethical or unethical, good or evil. So in this dimension, we approve of a character from moral and ethical perspective, or we disapprove of a character from the moral or ethical perspective. So these were the 4 dimensions which are employed in the analysis of the characters or the interpretation of the characters. The first one was psychological orientation, the second one was psychological orientation, the third one was metaphysical orientation, and the fourth is the ethical orientation. These orientations, perspectives or interpretations show us that from which perspectives or angles can a character be looked at, what other associations can be drawn or implied with a character which the writer has created, which on the surface might appear to be revealing some distinctive qualities. But when the analysis are started from various angles like psychological, sociological, ethical, or metaphysical, certain other meanings of the text and the characters are revealed to the reader. So this is the significance of the interpretation of characters and the study of the various dimensions of a character's personality that the literary stylistics focuses on. That apart from the thematic approach, where the theme, idea, or only the message is the concern of the analyst or the stylistician, the interpretation of characters or our focus on the understanding of the characters would reveal certain other meanings. And these understandings of characters, understanding from the metaphysical, ethical, psychological perspective, would also lead to the understanding of the theme. So this is how the concepts are interrelated, or they are intertextual. They are referring to something else that is employed by the writer in the text. And here also it is the theme or the message that is being conveyed through the character. Until or unless we analyze a character from these many or diverse angles or dimensions, we will not be able to understand the author's intention or the author's message within the text, either a poem or a novel. So this is how important the understanding of the character is, apart from the understanding of the theme of the story or a poem, because it would further bring us closer to the meanings. The dimensions are going to bring us closer to the meaning of the work. The interpretation of characters is also known as character analysis approach. Now that we have seen the 4 approaches of analyzing a character in a text, in a story, in a poem, or in a novel, we recognize that this has been done by us mostly as the students of literature, as the teachers of literatures, or as learners of literature, to be the character analysis approach. We often draw character sketches, we often draw character analysis for the sake of replying to the assignments or texts or even questions in the exams of the subjects of literature. And in our character analysis, we focus on the personality, either good or bad points of the personality of the character. And character analysis is intriguing activity, and we as students and teachers and analysts often expect to fall back on the knowledge of the psychology of their attempt to help their students understand the motivation of the characters in the story and how the story is forwarded, how the story is given more strength and vigor due to these psychological motivations and the leanings of the characters. So a character gives vigor and life to a story, and even it adds meaning to the story. So when a writer has created a character, there are particular means that the character would be understood through, and one of those means is psychological understanding of a text or the character of the text. The third notion that is of significance for the literary statistician is that of the narration, the element of narration. Now, element of narration is how the text is communicated or narrated. In it, we explicate literary selection by means of formal analysis of the elements of narration, which involves analyzing structure of the story. For example, taking it apart and the element by element. What are the formal elements? Most of all, in the story, certain basic elements like setting, character, plot are dissected. So when we focus on the elements of narration or the elements of a literary work, we as the literary analyst divide it into certain distinctive parts, which parts are more significant in literary writings: plot, character, setting. Now these are the basic elements that a literary analyst or even the learner or the teacher or the student of literature too would dissect from a text: setting, characters and plot. And each of these basic elements can be subjected to further analysis if a reader is to have a comprehensive understanding of the text by means of the understanding of the structure of the story. So if we are making use of the element of narration in our analysis of a text from the point of view of a literary statistician, we want to see what are the basic structures and components that are part of the text, that are the part of the literary writing. And from among these three structures or elements, we study plot, that is the events or the sequence of the events in the story, how things happen. What are the major events that are connected like the chain? For example, how does the story begin? How does it evolve and reach to a climax? How does it come to an end or conclusion? And what is the way the writer has made a connection through between certain events? How characters have been used as a device to connect one event to another? How the change of the situation or the setting too has been connected to the story through the movement of one character from another, or maybe there might be the elements like coincidence employed by the author for the sake of bringing about connections in the story or the events in the story. Apart from plot, we observe characters, just the way we do in the approach in which we were observing character analysis. Here also we see how characters have been created. Are they types? Are they individuals? Are they dynamic? Are they static or round characters? So there are further distinctive ways of analyzing the characters, that there may be the multi-dimensional characters who possess many traits, many qualities. The characters might be dynamic too, who change over the course of the story. They learn so much from their journey, from their experience in life that has been narrated by the novelist or the author in the story. Or the characters might be static, who do not change. They remain as they were in the beginning of the text or the story. And then we observe the elements like setting too. Now setting is another important feature of the style of the work. For example, where the work has been set, where does the action take place. For example, in Conrad's Heart of Darkness, the setting is very important. You cannot understand the theme of the story, message of the novelist without paying attention to the setting. The setting is that of the ship. On board a ship, a narrator narrates a story, and then the same narrator through the story takes the characters further into the ship, into the darkness of Africa. Now, characters being placed in London, in river Thames on a boat, that is the leisure boat or a leisure boat. Here the writer has particularly used the setting of ship, because the experiences that Marlowe, the character or the narrator, would narrate to the reader would also be taking place on a ship, but that would be there in Congo, Africa. And how this placement of the characters on ship reveals the idea of journey, reveals the idea of human life. There is a constant struggle and battle in the sea, in the waters. And then also it relates to the evening time, that the sun is setting, how it would lead to the idea of darkness of human heart, that the title Heart of Darkness refers to. So this is how the setting is also employed to convey the meaning or the message that is there in the theme of the work. So this aspect, that is the study of the elements of narration, in this we have looked at just 3 elements at a glance. These elements are referred to as setting, as characters, and as plot. Characters we looked at earlier as well, from the psychological, sociological and metaphysical leaning. Here we looked in detail at the idea of plot, or the sequence or the connection of events and happenings in a story or in a play. And also we looked at the idea of setting, that how does the setting and the description of the place where action occurs in a story, in a poem or in a play is also important for a literary stylistician, because a writer has with a great care made a selection or made a choice to put his characters in a particular place, time and area. Now what that place is, are the characters roaming around in the city or village or a countryside? This would also reveal the writer's theme, the writer's ideas. For example, you often start your study of the classical novel with the study of Joseph Andrews, and in Joseph Andrews by Henry Fielding, we see that the setting is that of the countryside, the villages of England. Now the countryside provides a chance of coming closer to the people of the rustic nature, people of the simple life. But the rustic life, according to Henry Fielding, is also not immune, is also not safe from the corruption, from the brutality that exists in the urban environment. So this is how the theme is connected with this setting. The place where the story occurs, the place where the poem has been captured or described, holds its significance for the writer from this particular angle as well, that he wants to convey certain message through the setting too. So this is how important the setting or the place where the action takes place in a story or in a work is. And this element of narration is very important from the point of view of a literary stylistician, because the elements of narration, from among the elements of narration, today we looked at the 2 major elements only, that is the element referred to as the plot as well as the setting. Characters we have observed in our analysis of the interpretation part, that how a literary stylistician would interpret characters from metaphysical, ethical and also the sociological angle. And when a literary stylistician observes the elements of narration, the 2 basic elements that he focuses on are of setting and of the plot. Setting is different from plot, that setting is the physical appearance or the place where the action takes place. For example, the setting is the countryside, the rural area, or the setting is the palace or the courts of the kings, or the setting might be the desert or the river, or the setting might be also a political time or era, for example, French Revolution or the 18th century. Now this idea of setting is connected with the meanings that the text conveys. The novel, the story or the poem have a significant connection with the place where the action occurs, where the incidents occur, and a writer deliberately puts or paints the images of a setting too. For example, we observed that how in Heart of Darkness, Conrad has painted the setting or the imagery with respect to the time of the evening, the setting sun, the darkness that is penetrating, and the forest or the earth that is moving away because the characters are placed in a ship. So how the theme is bound to be connected with the setting, because the setting and the way the writer paints the picture of the setting would convey the messages or the meanings which he is trying to convey to the reader. So today we looked at some of the basic features or elements which literary stylistics focuses on. We focused our attention on the approach that is referred to as thematic approach in stylistics, or in literary stylistics, that a literary stylistician, if approaching a text from the thematic point of view, would be interested to find out the meanings, either ideological, political, social, moral, or psychological. When a literary stylistician approaches a text in order to understand the characters, he looks at the characters from various dimensions. That again would be about the psychology of the character, the social life of the characters, the metaphysical and ethical leanings of the characters. Then, observing the other elements of literary stylistics, a stylistician would look at other forms of expression like plot or the sequence of events, and setting, the appearance and the place where the text occurs or where the events occur or take place. So this brings us to the end of today's lesson. We will in our next lecture continue our understanding of literary stylistics and certain other features that literary stylistics focuses on. Thank you.